of the worst doctor that you have ever seen. All of us can probably relate to going to a doctor's office, putting your trust in the medical system, expecting that you're going to hear something about what's going on with you, or at least get a cure, get some medication, whatever. And instead, you leave feeling awful, right? You may feel dismissed. You may feel violated in terms of your trust. There are lots of things that can happen when you don't see a good doctor. And so, just like that can happen with medicine, it can also happen with therapy. And so, I'm sure you're on this channel because you probably have experienced spiritual abuse and likely other types of abuse. And so, it's especially important that you look out for certain red flags when you are seeing a therapist. Um, just introduce myself. My name is Dr. Felicia. I'm a licensed psychologist, and I'm the owner of Skill Set Counseling. And a part of my work involves the treatment of recovery from and defense against spiritual abuse. So, on to the topic at hand. What are some of the red flags you should be looking out for when you're working with a therapist? Now I'm going to talk from my experience, being a therapist to other people and also supervising therapists, which I have also done before. And so between those two experiences, here are some things that I have learned and I have actually witnessed as I've supervised some therapy sessions. The first thing is being unprofessional. A lot of clients have complained about seeing a therapist that was just unprofessional. Now, what do I mean by unprofessional? Unprofessional can mean a lot of things. During the pandemic, a lot of the therapy sessions were happening via telehealth, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with telehealth. But when you appear via telehealth, the therapist should be professional, right? They should look professional. They should be in a quiet area where people aren't like running around and able to hear the conversation. But I've heard a lot of complaints about unprofessional behavior. So maybe if it was a telehealth appointment, the therapist was like in their bed or not dressed appropriately, right? Or still in their pajamas, which is just not acceptable. Okay. So there's that unprofessional behavior. And again, unprofessional behavior is not limited to dress. Another behavior that can be very unprofessional regarding a therapist is crossing the line from professional to friend, right? Anytime you see a therapist, now your therapist can be friendly with you, but you should not be hanging out with your therapist outside of therapy. And it really kind of concerns me how many instances that I have heard of people like doing social things with their therapist, right? Now, sometimes that may not be avoidable. So for instance, let's say you and your therapist are both, I don't know, maybe you're like some part of the same profession. Maybe you're both in like I don't know, construction or something, right? Let's just say that for, your therapist also does construction and you do construction. And maybe there's a construction convention and the two of you happen to bump into each other there. Okay. That's different though from hanging out with each other outside of therapy, right? It's called a dual relationship. And so you don't want a therapist that is going to do that or ask you to do that, so that's really important because sometimes, especially coming from an abusive background, if you have experienced abuse, it may be hard for you sometimes to feel like you even have like a voice in this situation or say like this makes me feel uncomfortable, whatever. So there's the unprofessional stuff, right? There's the clothing, there's the, hanging out outside of therapy. Um, Another really important red flag to look out for is when your therapist starts telling you too much about their personal life. Now, everybody is going to differ on that, right? So there's some therapists that believe you should never disclose anything about your life at all, right? And then there's some that will actually talk about some things that they have been through in the past. So, for instance, maybe you're going through a loss and maybe they also have had to grieve the loss of someone, so they might share that. The the rules, at least the ethics around that in my profession is that if you self-disclose, it has to be for the benefit of the client. And so I'm hearing, really horrible stories about therapists who are doing way too much self-disclosure in session. So they're talking about their past. They are crying in the session, right? Every week. And that's really like that's not appropriate. I'm also understanding too that therapists can experience burnout and their own personal problems. So it's not a judgment against the therapist, it's how they're choosing to handle that. And if a therapist is in a place where they're not doing so well, then ethically they need to put the client in a situation where they can get the best care. So the other red flag that I'm talking about right now, self-disclosure, talking too much. I have not really heard any complaints from clients about therapists that didn't share too much about their lives. But I hear a lot more about the other one where they're sharing too much and they're just being it's not only even disclosing too much, it's also like the emotionality, right? So they might be like crying a lot or just getting really like riled up. And then my next one is actually going to be lack of emotional control. And that is really important. And to me, this is one of those things where if that ever happens, I would strongly urge you to really rethink going back to that. Now, I'm not saying that a therapist showing any kind of emotion is wrong, right? There are many things that a therapist can show. I wouldn't even say show, maybe model for a client. Like, so for instance, maybe a client has difficulty admitting that they're angry, and the client tells the therapist a story about what happened to them. And the therapist is like, I'm so angry for you. Like, I can't believe that that happened, right? And so that's not a bad thing, right? A therapist can even explain or disclose that they're having discomfort around something that you as the client are doing. Now, while it might be uncomfortable, it also can be very informative, right? So some clients have said, wow, like I didn't know that this thing that I was doing was a problem or it affected people in this way. So I just want you to be very clear about that, that therapists are not supposed to be just like some blank slate with no emotions or reactions. However, if it is out of control or not expected or kind of like disproportionate to what happened, that is a huge red flag. Because just as doctors say that they will do no harm, it is the same for therapists, right? And so seeing those things, lack of emotional self-control, disclosing too much, blurring those boundaries, that's really important. Those are huge red flags. Um, and so I want you to be careful, when considering seeing a therapist, because if you are in these environments with that type of therapist, it can do a lot of harm. And so I hope none of you have ever been in that situation before. But if you have or you've heard about something like that, definitely put that in the comments. Another red flag that, it's really important to look out for is, you know, understanding like what is going on in therapy, right? So sometimes therapists may do something as part of your learning and your training. So for instance, okay, let me give you an example. So a part of what I also do is I work with individuals who have OCD, right? So let's say somebody has this thing with germs and they're very concerned about the germs. They have lots of intrusive thoughts. We're going to talk about it before they go and touch like a dirty doorknob as part of their exposure. You see what I mean? So you should have a general idea of what is going on in therapy. I've also heard people complain um, that they just felt like they weren't going anywhere in therapy, right? So they'd show up to sessions and they would just talk the whole time. And then the therapist would just nod along and then they go home, right? Now, sometimes that may be a beneficial way. Like I said, all of this, you really have to understand nuance if you're going to benefit from this channel. There may be some times where that is an appropriate intervention and technique in the sense that the therapist is not saying very much and the client is saying a lot, right? It doesn't always have to be 50-50. Sometimes there that is called for. Not only it's called for, it's helpful because some clients may never have had a safe place to just process and unload. The problem, though, happens when that happens all the time with no direction, right? If you're going into therapy for something, you should know, number one, what your concerns are that you're going to bring up with a therapist, but then also there should be some acknowledgement of how things are going, right? So, you that's something that you could talk to your therapist about, but it's important that you and your therapist like revisit your reasons for coming in. Now, the reasons for coming in are not set in stone, right? In fact, sometimes the reason that someone may come in for therapy is not the same thing that they're working on. So it's not so much I came into work on this, are we working on this? It's more of, is there progress happening? What is the plan? Can you see from a bird's eye view what are the things that are being worked on? And that's also really, really important because I've also heard a lot of stories about people saying that, what I talked about before, they just talked the whole time, the therapist said nothing, right? And then it was like, okay, well, time's up, go home, and that's it. So you want to be aware of that. And you also want to be aware of just the general, what is it called? Well, I'll try and explain it in lay people terms, but how you and your therapist connect, right? Not every person is going to be a match with every therapist, right? Just like, people can prefer different styles. Some people may prefer a more blunt and directive style of therapy. Some people may want something that's more gentle and more affirming. And then sometimes it's just, the things that you talk about and how they're perceived and, the relate basically you want to make sure that there's a good therapeutic connection between you and your therapist. If you feel like you cannot trust your therapist, that's a big red flag. It doesn't mean you can't trust your therapist, but you and your therapist need to explore why you feel like you cannot trust them. So I probably will end here. There is a lot that I can talk about. So in the comment section, you let me know what you would like to hear more about regarding therapist red flags. So I'm going to do a part two on this because there's a lot, and we probably all of us have not the best attention spans at times. So I'll do another video on that. And if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I would love to hear from you all too. What have been some red flags that you have experienced when you saw a therapist? What did you do about it? Did you talk with them about it? Did you just find another therapist? So I'd really be excited to hear from you guys about your experience. My website is skillsetcounseling.com. You can go there to find more information about my practice. I hope you have a wonderful day that's filled with peace. Bye bye.